Welcome and thanks for joining us for Two Steps Forward, our daily Bible study. I'm James, this is my wife Aid, and we are up to episode 307 in our study, which is Nehemiah 10 and 11. You are going to find some famous lists. Nehemiah's lists of people are what we're getting, the portion of Nehemiah that we're getting to. And so we're going to breeze through some of that. That's okay. We're going to talk about the importance of lists like this and a couple other things here today. So if you haven't read through 10 and 11, you can pause right now. Here is my summary for chapter 10. Concluding the period of prayer that we studied yesterday in Nehemiah 9, the Jews pledged faithfulness to the Lord. They made a statement of reorganized priorities with their leaders affixing their seals to it. And again, really in chapter 10 here, what you have is a list of names, those who sealed the written oath of faithfulness to God. Nehemiah listed 84 names. After listing himself, he mentions the names of 22 priests, 17 Levites, and 44 other leaders who are probably like heads of household. These individuals were all political, economic, and religious leaders who represented other men, women, and children. Each of the regulations that was described in the pledge that the Israelites are making to God required an exercise of faith in the fact that God was going to provide for peace, for food, for family. The specified commitments of the covenant were that, one, there would be no further intermarriage with foreigners, pagan foreigners. That was verse 30. Two, no business activity was going to take place on the Sabbath day. That's verse 31. Three, regular provisions for the temple work. So people are going to actually bring their offerings to support the ministry work. That's verses 32 to 35. Four, the dedication of the firstborn child in the family. That's verse 36. And then five, regular tithes are going to be given. Verses 37 to 39. It's drafted by the Levites. This is a covenant that characterized the Jews' desire to remain focused on the authority of the Bible and the importance of the temple and the responsibility, the personal ownership and responsibility of the people. So that's Nehemiah 10. So the first devotional thought here is just the value of written promises.
Who does number one with their thumb?
As I put it up, I saw it in the camera and I was like, there should be more thumb there. Like I have my dad's kind of stubby thumbs and it should be like this high, but I have like mutated small thumbs, like a dew claw, like for animals. And in that day and age, the value of written promises. Oral tradition was the norm in the world at the time. You have less writing going on, obviously less printing. Nonetheless, when people wanted additional levels of accountability, they would write things down and seal them publicly. So the Israelites write this oath of faithfulness and they have their leaders all seal it. And the idea, what they understand is verbal promises are too easy to get by with. An illustration I ran across not too long ago with this that I thought was really interesting is a minister when he did weddings. So he always did premarital counseling. And in his premarital counseling, he had all of his couples write priorities for their marriage. Mm-hmm. Now, I do this too. What I don't do that he did is every year on their anniversary, he has them write the priorities. He has them read the priorities. He records it. Mm-hmm. And every year he sends them the recording of them reading their priorities going into marriage. It's a fair amount of paperwork. Maybe he has an administrative assistant that sends these things out on anniversaries. But nonetheless, I like the idea, like you made a vow, you are bound before God and these witnesses to that vow. And therefore it's a good idea for you to continue to keep this. Like currently what you're feeling or currently what you're angry about or currently your dissatisfaction in the marriage, is this what you vowed? Or when you said for better or worse in sickness and health, etc., like that was an actual vow with teeth in it that like you have to pay attention.
They do this on Grey's Anatomy.
What?
When Derek and Meredith got married, they wrote their vows on a Post-it note. Well, they actually married themselves, so they literally just wrote their vows on a Post-it note and then they said, "We're married."
That's weird.
But they framed the Post-it note and then would keep it in their house, and whenever the other one would get mad and be like, "Oh, I'm so mad, I'm gonna leave," they would be like, "Nope, I call Post-it. The Post-it note says you can't leave." Then they wouldn't leave.
A lot of valuable spiritual lessons learned through Grey's Anatomy. But yes, it's accountability. Like accountability attached to vows, which are different from feelings. Okay, so that's devotional thought 1, the value of written promises. Here is my summary for Nehemiah chapter 11. Chapter 11 resumes the story begun in Nehemiah 7, which, so if you go back to Nehemiah 7, 4 through 5, there was a story that kind of ended there. And we got into this whole like confession worship period of Israel, which was kind of an aside. But those passages mention Nehemiah's plan to repopulate Jerusalem as he began the census that was necessary for resettlement. And after the intervening account of the covenant renewal, the narrative now returns to the topic of re-inhabiting Jerusalem. Most of the Jews had chosen to refrain from living in Jerusalem since its fall in 586 BC. So people went over to Babylon. There's a first wave of people who come back. A lot of them, very few of them, are actually living near Jerusalem because with no walls, it's really dangerous. Anyone foolish enough to live there was like easy prey for robbers. There was, like there kind of is today, there was more crime in the city. So without protection, you're vulnerable. The Jews who returned in exile typically chose to build homes, and actually often nice ones, in like the suburbs of Jerusalem. Nehemiah knew that God wanted his people re-centralized in Jerusalem, though, and to accomplish that, for starters, he required the leaders of the Jews to live in the city. So he said, okay, everybody who's leading in the city, you're going to live here. Number 2, some Jews graciously volunteered to move into the city. So we'll leave our homes behind and we will come and actually live in the city. To complete the repopulating process, though, the people agreed to cast lots so that the number of Jews who lived in Jerusalem was exactly a tenth of the Jews who had returned from captivity. They said, we need at least 10% of our people centrally located here in Jerusalem. If the number of those who settled there from these lists are added up, the number of adult males actually comes to about 3,044. If the women and children are added to that, you're looking at a number over 10,000. Since that's supposed to be a tenth of the people resettled back in the Jerusalem area, that means we assume in the greater area there's probably a little over 100,000 people there at the time. All right, so that's my summary for Nehemiah 11. Devotional thought number 2. Serving God by where you live. So it's fascinating that God, through Nehemiah, actually forced his people to move into Jerusalem. Some of his people, not all of them, some. The main reason is because, remember, the temple is there. And so in the Old Testament, the primary place where God was located, where his word was located, where his worship was near the temple, or at the temple in Jerusalem. The Jews needed to recommit, in general, their desire to be near God. So they needed some of them to live where God like locally dwelled. The main application here then, I think, however, is that Christians can and should choose where they live based on how they think they can best glorify God. In other words, they don't choose where they live simply based on what the rest of the world does, which is what is my personal preferences. It's not that those can't factor in, but missional living means like, yeah, I would even choose where I live based on where do I think I can best serve in the kingdom. That could include implications for like where you take jobs. It could include, do I live in the city versus the suburbs versus rural areas? All of that. It could include if I live overseas. We had church tonight. We kind of are sending one of our young guys to do work overseas. Like he's doing that because he believes that's where God wants him to minister right now, So that's choosing where you live based on your capacity to do kingdom impact. How much have you thought about, I know we've talked about, where we live and that sort of thing, not only just in Milwaukee, but even where in Milwaukee. How much have you thought, though, about choosing a location specifically for the purpose of serving God?
This is all we do.
What do you mean?
Do you think I wanted to live in Minnesota?
Yeah, well, you didn't choose that either, really. You chose to marry me, and then I went to Minnesota.
Well, you had a choice to go or not go. You didn't have to go there.
Theoretically, I mean, there's so.
I'm saying you didn't choose to live there based on personal preference.
Right, but so
You chose to go there because that's where God called you to go.
Right. Yeah.
And that's why we came to Milwaukee. We didn't shoot just like, oh, Milwaukee looks like a good city.
Right. Yes, I think I get what you're saying, but the point is that like it's ministry capacity to some extent, choosing where you live. But what about okay? So moving forward, not just you, but like people in general are. I mean, I think we've had some friends, for instance, who have. And I'm always impressed by this. One of the things they'll look into, like if they have a job offer, is like, is there a church nearby that I would be, like comfortable going to or wherever. I just was talking to a friend earlier tonight and had a job offer in a different state or a job possibility at least, and said like, I realize we have so many friends and here, our church here, our like built-in support system, it would really be hard. Like, it's not like it's one or the other. It's not an equal playing field. We have there's so many other things other than work. So I think for the Christian to say like, yeah, I can and should bring God into the decision-making process of where I live. So, all right, devotional thought number 3, a matrix for decision-making. So I think the whole process of this is kind of interesting too. It's not just that Nehemiah says, all right, you're going to live here and you're going to live there. So Nehemiah is like this visionary leader. He becomes like, he's the governor. He becomes a wise policymaker. He knew, even though a majority of people did not want to live in Jerusalem and the Jews are not going to survive without a critical mass of people living in the city. And so he said, look, I get it. Not everybody wants to do this, but for us as from a macro standpoint, as a body to survive, we need this to happen. And so what he did is he said, look, we have to have 10% or so of our population live centrally located in Jerusalem. A lot of you, obviously it's an agricultural time in life. Most people farmed for a living. So a lot of them had nice farms and farming locations outside of the city. That was tough to give up. It was comfortable for them in many ways. Nehemiah's system is, he says, okay, if you're going to be a leader in this nation, you have to live in the city. The second thing he says is, okay, I'm going to open it up to volunteers. Some of you are going to recognize this as a personal ministry and personal calling, and you have the option to move into the city. And that fills up another portion of the group, but they're not the 10% yet. And then for the last of them, he says, look, everybody in the nation we're going to draw, we're going to cast lots. And if it falls to you, you're moving in the city. It's not that I'm saying you want it. Those are the people who are clearly the most begrudging, probably. But he's like, you're doing it because as God's people, as a nation, we're requiring this of you, even though it's not totally your choice. But my point is, it's not just like this dictator who's telling everybody what they're going to do. There's some volition involved. People can voluntarily move there, but it's also not a democratic process where we're just going to put it to a vote to see what happens. It's an interesting, for me personally, as like a church leader, it's really fascinating, especially as we're going through a little bit of a transition right now. We have some decisions to make about things like worship service times and stuff like that. It's like, well, how do you go about making that decision? You don't just put it to a vote. You don't just maybe have one leader say like, okay, this is what we'll do. You probably have to go through a kind of a combination of things that is, again, kind of a complex matrix that reasonably addresses the issue, but also pushes people. Some people will do things voluntarily. Some people are going to have to be pushed outside of their comfort zones, but it's the right thing to do, How do you understand the way most churches make their decisions today?
And don't they have some sort of like volunteers that sit on a council and then those people vote or something? So ultimately, though, someone has to say, no, this is what we're doing.
Right. So
ultimately you have to say, after all of this is what we're going to do.
Right. There is a level by which you can't vision can't come from every possible location. So there has to be somebody, and usually, truly, if you're a nonprofit organization, you have to have a group of elected participants that serve as governing. So there's a necessity for churches to do that kind of thing. But it is interesting when you go from church to church, it's a little different. I've known churches, and granted, even from theological tradition to one to the other, so Presbyterianism, for instance, name comes from presbyters, who are like elders in a congregation, who are not only like the theological, people who ensure quality theology, but they're also like some policymakers and decision makers in the congregation. They're the most spiritually mature people, are the ones that we entrust as representatives to make decisions. But you go to, there's a lot of, for instance, Baptist churches where the pastor and his wife, they own the property, they make all the decisions, and it's like you can hop on board with this or not.
Yeah, it's the first lady.
Yeah. There are churches that I do know that are governed almost entirely, that I've been part of, that are almost entirely governed by democratic process. Like, we're going to put this to a vote and majority wins always. And then it's like, well, what do you do if the majority, their heart is not quite in the right place, So I think what I'm saying is here, what we see Nehemiah doing, I think, is a really wise process that doesn't fit into any one like nice and neat category that I think people tend to think in. It's a mature process that takes into account everybody's needs, but nonetheless says, okay, God's will is this, so we're going to meet this as a body. Everybody has to think about the body more than they think about their personal preferences. Any final thoughts on decision making or where you live for serving God or anything like that?
No.
Okay, let's close with a prayer then. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time in your word, even things like lists in the Bible, which aren't necessarily our favorite things to read. They nonetheless have some practical value. First, they show that you know everyone, and that every deed that is done out of obedience to you or to glorify you, you notice. There's nobody's decisions, nobody's faithfulness that goes unnoticed. We also find just some practical wisdom in this. As God's people are being aligned by their leaders, we recognize the beauty of the body ahead of any one individual. And that's hard on some individuals, but help us each have a spirit of the unity of your body, which is bigger than any one of us. And with you as our head, that's way more important than any one person's feelings or desires or anything else. So help us to have a humble attitude that seeks to glorify you, seeks to put others ahead of ourselves, and recognizes that we do this because you first did it for us. In obedience, may it glorify your name. Amen. Thanks for studying with us. We will see you next time for Nehemiah chapter 12.